Hi, my name is John Brink. Thank you for joining us. You're watching A History of the BC Forest Industry. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Brink. My guest today is Harry Gairns. Harry is a professional forester as well as a professional engineer. Thank you for joining us, Harry. So, you've been involved in the forest industry in British Columbia for a long, long time. And so, can you tell me a little bit about your background? Where were you born and some of the early days?
Yes, well, my family originated in the north with the gold rush in 1898. So I was born in Atlin, just south of the Yukon border in BC, and had my early schooling there until we moved to Vancouver for high school and university.
And you went to UBC and got your designation for registered professional forester, but then it was different, right? Not only, it was mainly professional engineer and with an addition of registered professional forester?
Well, in actual fact, what you get is a degree from UBC. You don't get a designation.
Right.
You get a bachelor's degree in applied science with a forestry option, and then with some experience and writing some tests and theses and so on, you can become registered as a professional forester and a professional engineer if you have graduated in that program.
Right. And so you are now retired.
Yes, and I'm only really allowed to use the title registered professional engineer and registered professional forester.
So that would so that would be the official designation, right?
Yes.
And then what brought you to the forest industry, and in particular in northern British Columbia?
Well, I entered UBC with the idea I was going to be a civil engineer, and I had a neighbor that was in the forest products business, and he says that he's the guy who convinced me to become a forest engineer. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what he tells us.
Yeah.
And so I did the years at UBC, and when I graduated, the opportunities for employment were as a logging engineer in a logging camp on the coast of BC, or a trainee forester in Clearwater, or a position in Prince George with Industrial Forestry Service, and I chose that.
Yeah.
Mostly because it was a community that I thought I was going to get married in September. This was in June, and it was a community that I thought I could live in and raise a family with my wife.
And what year was that?
1955.
1955.
Yeah.
And and you then started. Actually, you already spent some time before here during the summers, right?
Yes, I worked one summer for the forest inventory for the Ministry of Forest.
Right.
And that was in Fort St. James.
Right.
So I was familiar with the area.
Yeah. And then Industrial Forest Service is still a company that is in Prince George, but when you joined them in 1955, it was, relatively speaking, a relatively small company.
Yes, well, so was the forest industry.
Exactly.
At that point. And there was about 5 or 6 people at Industrial Forestry Service.
Yeah. And how was the mills were still in that period? There were a lot of mills around the Prince George area. How many mills would there have been here?
Well, I think at that point, it was probably down to somewhere 600 or 800, but it had been as high, I think, as 1,200 mills here.
So, and those were smaller sawmills?
Oh yes. When the timber got too far for the tractor to pull the logs to it, they just moved the mill. We call them a sawmill, but they were very primitive, a lot of them.
Yeah. So they would cut the lumber, and then the rough lumber. What happened with that? Where did it go?
Well, within anything within 100 miles of Prince George, basically, I guess, or 50 miles anyway, came to Prince George and was stacked up along First Avenue on Planer Row, as we called it.
Yeah.
And then was air dried, no dry kilns, and then was planed and shipped from the VCR or the CN site here.
Yeah, and Plainer Road was called Plainer Road because the Plainer Mills were there.
That's
and that
right.
is now called River Road. So you have the North Nechako on the one side,
Right.
and then the key was the railroad was
Yeah.
next to it. So the finished products would be loaded in boxcars or whatever to go to market.
Oh yes, in those days it all went with boxcars.
Right.
You know, a big chunk of the labor of producing lumber was loading the boxcars.
Right. Loose loading it,
Yeah.
hand bombing it into.
Hand loading the boxcars.
Yeah, and then you know then the industry was still in its beginning stages. How did they access the timber, like the little mills? How did they had no timber rights, or what did it look like in terms of accessing timber?
Well, if a mill owner knew where there was a patch of timber, had to be 140 years old at the time.
Right.
If he knew where a patch was, he could talk to the Forest Service, and they would come out and, if they agreed with it, they would cruise that patch of timber and designate some boundaries around it. Usually, if it was a patch of spruce in the middle of the pine forest, the boundary would be zigzagged around the spruce because the pine was worth nothing at the time.
That was a weed.
Yes, and then that timber would come up for public auction.
Right.
And the mill owner that had prompted the action would hope that he could be the successful bidder for that timber. So if he wasn't, then he might find a piece somewhere else and have to move his mill. But moving a mill was not a big deal.
No. Yeah, and so that's how it operated then. How did it go forward from there? And you know, I believe there was a Royal Commission and the Sloan Commission, one in 1945, and then there was another commission in 1955, I believe, a Sloan Commission. What changed then?
Well, there was a move towards better arrangements so that mills could be, a better mill could be built. At the same time, people had discovered that you could have what's called an arch truck, a good heavy-duty six-wheel drive truck with an arch on the back could pick up a load of logs and on a niced-up road could take it quite a distance to a
Right.
mill. So that meant that you didn't have to have a little two-bit mill that you could move every couple of years. You could have a reasonable mill that could get a bit better recovery. Like we know that a 2x4 is only, in those days it was 1 5/8, now it's 1.5 inches
Exactly,
wide.
yeah.
But they were cutting those 2x4s 2.5, 2.25 inches
Yeah.
wide
Yeah.
because the saw was wobbling around and so on. So in came the sash gang saw, a big frame went up and down and pushed a log through it and it cut it all into 2-inch pieces.
Yeah, we can still see that really
so-
at the Forest Museum.
Yeah, and at that time,
yeah.
that was not a museum piece, that was a real new
Exactly.
technology. And so the mills then became a little more centered. At that time, a lot of the mills were on water.
Right.
Most people thought you had to have water and have a jack ladder to bring the log into the mill.
Yeah.
So
So what happened then from there on forward? Then all of a sudden something happened in the late 50s and the 60s where they were trying to recover more from the timber and mills started to locate into town. What prompted that?
Well, I mean, I like to think that it happened partly as a result of a meeting we had of the national body of the Canadian Institute of Forestry in Prince George in 1959. And we had shown the delegates a sawmill in the Crooked River that had a sash gang saw and a teepee closed burner. Prior to these days, most of the burning beside a mill was in a little pit with a bit of corrugated metal around it.
Exactly.
And the sawdust was blown into a pile.
Right.
And when the mill moved, that's the way it was left.
Yeah.
So we thought this was a pretty good mill. And we did at the time also show a piece of timber that had been burnt, and we're really quite seriously concerned about the fire that had taken this piece of timber so it was no longer valuable.
Right.
But an industrial forester from New Brunswick was at the meeting, and he said, you know, you're so proud of these teepee burners that you've got, but I might be wrong, but I think there's enough wood being burnt up in those that would supply a pretty good sized pulp mill.
Yeah.
And so Harold Moffat, who was then the chair of the Prince George Industrial Development Committee,
Yeah.
or Commission, he hired Industrial Forestry Service, which was the place that I was working, to do a little report on how much
And
maybe...
that was in January 1960.
That's right.
Yeah.
Really effectively caused by that, that conference.
Right.
So we
And
did this report.
everything changed.
Yeah, a $200 report said there was quite a volume.
Yeah.
And you might remember, well, you were maybe not here, but Ray Williston waved that report around as a
Yeah.
$200 report that changed the world as far as he was concerned.
Yeah, and Ray Williston was the Minister of Forest during that period, and he was the MLA from Prince George South,
yeah.
I believe. And so that changed everything, and all of a sudden that created an interest by, in particular, Noranda.
Well, first Canfor.
Canfor, yeah.
And so when the pulp mill indicated an interest, they said, well, this is fine, but how do we get that material?
Right.
How can we be sure that we will get it?
Right.
So they decided they would create a thing called a pulpwood harvesting agreement area.
Right.
And within that area, if a company, sawmill company, harvested timber and put in a chipper, then they would be selling their chips to that particular mill.
Correct.
And the deal was, though, that if they agreed to take the smaller timber, much of which would be in the chips in the end, they would get quite an increase in their allowable harvest, because the
Right.
harvest up to that time had been based on some rough approximations based on taking trees 12 inches on the stump up to an 8-inch top.
Yeah.
And so when
Quite
they
wasteful.
said, okay, we're going to take down to 8 inches to a
Yeah.
4-inch top,
Yeah.
a whole bunch of forest that had never been considered to be merchantable became useful.
Exactly.
And a lot of that, of course, was the lodgepole pine that had never even been, a little of that was
Even
made
considered.
into car decking or something,
Yeah.
and railway ties, but that
Yeah.
was about it for pine.
Yeah.
Until this. So pine then became quite a valuable species.
Yeah.
And so the mills were anxious, the sawmills were anxious to get the extra cut.
Right.
And the pulp mills were happy not to have to get into the logging business necessarily.
Right.
So they would agree to buy the chips.
And so then what happened is that, more interest came in and starting to buy up existing operations, mill operations, and more of consolidation happened in the mid-60s, really.
Well, pretty well right away, if you were going to deliver chips, you pretty well had to relocate your mill to the railway.
Right.
And so
For
that was a
transport.
major expenditure.
Yeah.
That forced some mills to consolidate with one another.
Right.
And at the same time, these mill owners, lots of them had been Saskatchewan imports
Yeah.
to BC back in 20s, 30s, 40s.
Yeah.
They were at an age where they wanted to retire.
Right.
And so it was a prime time to be buying up smaller operations.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the number of mills went from 800 to 200 to 100 to 50 to 20.
And if you look now around the area, Harry, I can't even think of 4 or 5 where there are owners, operators around anymore.
Yeah.
All those now we have major operators, in particular Canfor, West Fraser, and some of the other majors, that are pretty much dominating
Right.
the field. Then the other period that happened as well is that we had a beetle attack in the Bowron region, I believe in the early 80s. That's really where the beetles really started, right? And
Well-
why would that? And then the next thing, the pine beetle.
Yeah.
Why does that happen?
Well, the spruce beetle spruce beetle normally only attacks a freshly downed tree.
Right.
And a lot of blowdown had occurred in the Bowron Park,
Correct.
just to the south,
Correct.
and the beetles were in that.
Right.
And so the theory was, I remember, I was at the time the president of the Professional Foresters Association.
Right.
We went to the minister in Victoria and said, we want to harvest that downed spruce in the park
Right.
and get it out of there before the beetles spread.
Exactly.
It's a park. We couldn't do that.
No.
And there was no way that was going to change. And of course, what happened was the beetles flew northward
Yeah.
into the Bowen and basically wiped out a good piece of the spruce in the
Exactly.
Bowen.
Yeah. So then from there on in, that was in 1983. During the 80s, the Bowen region, and we thought that was one of the largest clear cuts. They could see it from the satellites in the sky,
Right.
but it was dwarfed by what happened to the pine beetle epidemic, really from 2000, late 1990s to 2015, 16, 17, 18. And still there is some of it, but not much that has economic value for making lumber. So what happened to the pine beetle? Where did that all start?
Interesting. Well, it came north from the U.S.
Right.
Certainly was more serious south of the border earlier.
Right.
But in the north, the first real major was in Tweedsmuir Park.
Right.
And we had the same kind of situation. We said we should
Blow
do
down.
something about it, but it was in a park. So it really was inevitable. The pine was old,
Right.
and so there was really no way to avoid it. Now, the one thing about the pine beetle is, the immediate, fairly immediate, you got a stain in the wood.
Right.
At first, that looked like it was curtains for the pine trees,
Right.
but
Right.
with some research, they discovered it really wasn't a strength
Right.
problem, and so that wood was usable. With the spruce, the effect of the beetle is much more quick. The trees rot very quickly, actually, from
Once
the
they are on the
outside.
ground.
Pardon me?
Once they are on the ground.
Oh, even standing.
Is there even
Oh yeah.
standing?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So the spruce beetle salvage won't be prolonged as long as the pine beetle salvage was.
Right.
It has to happen faster.
Right. So as a result of all of this, and and then associated to all of that with so much wood being on the ground, that affected by beetles, there has become real pressure on what they call the annual allowable cut, where we normally had, say, about 60 million cubic meters annually in the province. It was uplifted in the interior to as high as 80 million. Now we are going down to something approaching 40 million cubic meters annually. That puts us in a position where we have too much capacity and not enough timber.
Right.
And that likely will be for quite a period of time. Hence, a lot of people, jobs are affected, communities are affected, and I think up to close to 20 mills have shut down in the interior of the province already. How do you see that looking forward in the future? We still have an industry. We have this beautiful province with there is no place better than Canada, no place better than BC, but an absolute amazing area to grow timber for making lumber in commercial markets. Yes. Are you fairly optimistic about the industry coming back? Maybe not quite to the same extent?
Well, I'm optimistic to an extent.
Yeah.
At the time when all of this expansion of the industry occurred, they set up what they called timber supply areas.
Right.
And they were calculating what kind of a harvest we could recover from those.
Right.
And in that process, a lot of work was done to determine the ages of the trees and
Correct.
how much area there was in various different categories and so on. And computer simulation programs were developed where you could forecast on a computer harvesting a certain level, and it would actually pick the stands out of the data that would be harvested, and then would be planned to be reforested and so on. And you could carry that through out into the future to see what would happen. And
up to 100, 200, 300 years.
Right, exactly. And so, you could harvest at your 80 million cubic meters, but then eventually it would fall back to 50 million or something,
Right.
which would be the long-term
Right.
harvest level. So the decision by basically the brass in Victoria, I suppose, and maybe the politicians too, was they didn't want to invite that kind of a problem with allowing a big increase in harvest
Right.
for 50 years and then have a big decline. So
They want to create a sustainable
that's right.
yield.
And so
No,
they said, well, what we'll do is we'll run this simulation and we'll try it at different levels.
right,
And if we get the highest level that will carry through for 300 years,
Right.
we'll set the harvest level at that level.
right,
Now, unfortunately, if you really looked in detail at what trees were being planned to harvest out 200 years into the future, they were 300 and 400-year-old spruce trees,
right,
250 to 300-year-old pine trees,
Right.
and we knew even then that those trees wouldn't last that long.
no,
So what we had then was the bubble that they didn't want to happen,
Right.
followed by the decline that they didn't want
because
to
of the
happen.
beetle,
Yeah, it happened anyway.
right,
So the natural forces forced what we could have planned for,
Right.
but didn't. So
So if we kind of look, we have this amazing province with this amazing land base that will grow a viable forest, that we have work to do on the way we model, likely as I hear it from you. And if we compare ourselves to areas that are similar, like Sweden, they virtually harvest double the volume per hectare that we do. So is that part of it is modeling and part of it is spending more money at the land base and
I don't think any of it is modeling. I
Right.
think it is growing
right,
the timber to harvest that level, or
Right.
just doing the things we do now in BC, which are pretty rudimentary forest practices.
right,
Unfortunately, the problem is that those forests that have that wonderful growth rate are practically all private ownership. And in BC, we've taken the position that the people own the forests,
right,
with a very few exceptions.
right,
And so it's very hard for governments to make the kind of investments that would be required
right.
I'm really not that hopeful that we can achieve what has been achieved in Scandinavia because of the ownership problem.
Right,
I worked on a commission once with the Dean of Forestry and a coastal consultant and somebody from the Forest Service, and we concluded that the only real answer was to introduce some way that the private investor could operate in that system. And it would mean that you'd have to give some kind of a lease for a long period of time, more than one rotation. And then the leaseholder would have an incentive to do that intensive forestry.
So would that be maybe potentially, rather than a volume-based tenure, it would be an area-based tenure? Or a mixture thereof?
It would be a lease, which is an
Yeah.
area-based tenure.
Yeah,
The payment to the Crown would be based on its current productivity.
right.
If you did better with that,
So now you're incented to make sure that you grew more timber, right?
exactly.
And
right.
then you would have to get the benefit from
Yes,
that.
yes.
So there is something that we still have all the elements that could make us successful. There is no reason that we cannot grow in time the same volume as people do in Sweden, but we have some work to do on the way we allocate timber and the way we attract capital into the system. I will have to, again, at some point sit down with you and again go into the next stage and see what that looks like.
Yeah.
It has been an honor to have you here, Harry.
Okay.
And, and I want to continue this at some other point. Thank you very much for watching us today on a history of the BC forest industry. Our guest today was Mr. Harry Gairns, who is a professional engineer and a registered professional forester who has a lot of knowledge and experience in the industry, and far too much for us to have just one interview. So we hope to see Harry again if he's available to take us into where do we go from here and how do we do it, and Again, it was my pleasure to have you here as the host of A History of the BC Forest Industry.
Okay, thank you.